Hello, and welcome to this presentation of the lesson on the mass higher education era, Hegemony, 1945 to 1975, for High Ed Course 5360. The presenters for this group presentation are as follows. Part 1, Societal Context and Institutions, will be presented by myself, Amanda Hurd. Part 2, which will cover students, faculty, curriculum, and instruction of the era, will be presented by Sarah Hegler. And Part 3, which will cover governance, finance, and outcomes of the era, will be presented by Chase Ragland. So to begin with the social context of this time period, which is called Hegemony, but referred to as mass higher education era, there was a great deal of social change that was taking place during this time period in America. There were wars, changing economy, and sweeping social changes as well. Enrollments increased from 1.7 million in 1945 to 11.2 million by 1975. Higher education grew to a place where it was seen as being not only for the elite. To begin with, it started at the end of World War II. In 1945, World War II ended, and this brought about changes in the American economy and job force. A movement of industrial labor jobs was going overseas. American business people were sending jobs overseas to get cheaper contract labor. So there was also a rapid population growth going on, known as the baby boom, and economic expansion in America. The fastest growing occupations here at home became technical and professional workers. Now, during this time, American families were beginning to have more disposable income than at any time before, and they had more time before they needed to enter the workforce, which created a perfect opportunity for college education. The GI Bill had a great influence on mass higher education and the movement of people into colleges and universities. In 1944, Congress was fearful of mass unemployment rates when soldiers returned home from fighting. So they passed a bill that paid tuition and living expenses for 1 year for every serviceman returning home from war. Each individual serviceman also got an additional month of tuition and benefits for each month of service he had given to his country. So this paved the way toward doubled enrollments nationwide over the following years. Nearly half of all returning 15 million servicemen participated in this program. Now, in 1946, shortly after the war ended, President Truman created the Truman Commission on Higher Education, which was very important to the future and the growth of higher education. The commission was tasked with the analysis of the U.S. education system, particularly focused on higher education. And the goal was to enable higher education to take its proper place in strengthening the democracy and enriching the lives of citizens. One of the major things that came out of the Truman Commission was, in their final report, was the establishment, the need to establish community colleges to make education publicly available to anyone who could benefit from it. And then we moved into a period of time known as the Cold War, which came shortly after the end of World War II. It didn't take very long. The Soviets exploded their atomic bomb in 1949, and by this they demonstrated their power and their scientific ability to match the U.S. So here we have this communist country rivaling the power of the United States, and there was a very strong message that was sent. So during the 1950s, this era of super patriotism and fear of communism was ushered in. There's what we refer to as the space race that was happening during this time, which is critical to the evolution of higher education, in that we were essentially in a race with the Soviets for who could educate, who could be the brightest and the strongest nation on earth. This intellectual race against the communists was on in the form of the space race, and who could reach the moon first. Supporting science and education was an effort to build the strongest government on earth. To be the best, we had to have the most intelligent, the most creative, the most forward-thinking and innovative population. So therefore, it became a huge priority to invest in educating our citizens.
But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win.
This was also the era of equal rights movements. In 1954, Brown versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court ruled that separate but equal was inherently unequal. In 1956, the court extended the ruling to higher education in Florida ex rel. Hawkins versus Board of Control. Colleges were becoming desegregated throughout this time. The Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964. In 1966, there was a formation of the National Women's Organization. College registrations for African Americans and women were on the rise, and there was progress toward equal rights throughout this era. Also, there was the Vietnam War happening during this time period. Male student enrollments reached the highest level in response to the Vietnam draft. Students were active and vocal in anti-war protests. There were great social implications from the Vietnam War, from the draft itself, and everything that was going on during this time in America. When it comes to institutions, we see a great rise in the number of institutions. There were more than 600 public institutions added and 650 private institutions added during this time period of 1945 to 1975. 500 two-year colleges were added, and there was a decrease in the percentage of single-sex institutions. There was a boom in community college establishment. There was great expansion throughout this era, and during this time, research institutions, regional universities, and community colleges experienced their greatest expansion to date. State funding helped colleges grow research facilities, and then they became more selective in their admissions requirements. And as they strove to compete for status, they strove against one another until the end of this era. Here are the resources used for this section of the presentation, and I will now happily turn it over to Ms. Sarah Hagler for Part 2.